and welcome to Denton's Tales. And this time, part 2 of the Vikings in Ireland. We left part 1 with Ivar and Bainlossi, or Ivar the Boneless, a very famous Viking leader, perhaps the most famous of all Viking leaders, who may or may not have actually been boneless or indeed had anything wrong with him at all, other than possibly erectile dysfunction. But he was undoubtedly the most famous Viking leader in Ireland, or probably the most famous Viking leader pretty much anywhere. So now, let's just look at the continuing Norse presence in Ireland, the expansion of their activities, and what may be a popular myth connected with that. Popular myths, of course, regarding the Vikings abound, and many of them repeated by those who really should know better, but they just go on repeating them ad nauseum. Very intense Norse settlement began around the year 914 AD, with numerous long ports popping up around the Irish coast, some of which went on to become principal cities, among them Limerick, Wexford, Waterford and Cork. Now, a very interesting thing about the latter, Cork. There was a monastic settlement there that went on living quite happily, unharmed, right beside the Norse settlement. The monks actually obtaining hard-to-get foreign goods from the Norsemen. They were probably the only monks in Ireland who actually welcomed the sight of the dragon ships approaching, not having to sort of, hastily grab up anything of value they could find. Here, give me that chalice, give me those coins, give me that there quick, and then carry them and run and get up into a round tower and pull up the ladder and hide from the Vikings. Or did they? Now, there's a thing. The Irish round tower. Now, that was basically a tall, thin, cylindrical stone structure with a pointed top, averaging between 59 and 130 feet, with an entrance doorway accessed by a ladder, 10 feet or more above the ground. Some 120 of these towers are thought to have been built, most of them that survive today being in varying degrees of ruin. And there are also 2 in Scotland and 1 on the Isle of Man. Their purpose, we were always told, having been defensive, built because of the Viking raids, that they would give the monks protection of approaching raiders by lookouts posted at the top of the tower, since there were little windows around the top, and providing safety for them and whatever valuables they could grab, getting into the tower and pulling up the ladder. The door was too high to be easily broken. You couldn't use a battering ram or anything on it because it was too high up, and it was hard to set it on fire. And even had the raiders got inside, well, the monks would have gone up higher onto another level, and they would have pulled up the access ladders with them, so you couldn't follow them up. Yeah, that all seems to make sense, doesn't it? It sounds perfectly reasonable. But is it true? Or is it just another myth, like the Viking horned helmets? Now, the Irish word for them translates as bell house. And that really is a bit of a clue. I don't think you have to be Lieutenant Columbo or Sherlock Holmes to see something about that, suggesting they were actually intended for use as a bell tower, belfry. And it has also been pointed out, you see, that they have very, very shallow foundations for such high, tall structures, so that an entrance door at ground level, well, that would have affected the structural integrity of the building, because it would have been basically a hole in the courses of the stonework at lower level, and that could have affected the stability of the structure. That being the reason for its being placed further up, rather than any defensive intention. It was simply there to improve the structural security integrity of the building. Some are also not placed in a position where they command any view of the approaches, and they couldn't have provided a warning if 20 men had been up there keeping watch. And in any case, once the Vikings found out that the monks took all their valuables into the towers, well, would they not simply brought a ladder on the next raid? ladder would have been very easily carried across the two cradles that held the sail when it was lowered, or just lashed to the mast. You didn't really need to be a rocket scientist to work out something like that. But if a thing is 10 feet off the ground, there's some lovely valuables behind it, all you need is, lad, it's not really very, very hard to figure out something like that. Once up to the tower door, of course, then they could easily smash it in, throw, kindling and wood into the tower and set it on fire. And since these structures were basically a chimney, the smoke and the heat would have gone straight up through them, thus forcing anyone above to come down, or indeed even setting the upper wooden platforms alight. Now, I'm sure the monks did run to the towers on occasions. They would, after all, delay the Viking raiders, even if they did try to get into them. And maybe that might give the local Irish chieftain time to gather men and come to the rescue. And obviously the monks would be safer inside the tower than they would out in the open. But that the towers were purposely built for defence against the Vikings, that their purpose was purely defensive, as has often been stated, or that the monks took all their valuables into the towers with them, well, that seems highly unlikely. Going into the towers and leaving the valuables outside, now that would make perfect sense. Giving the monks personal protection and not giving the raiders any reason to follow them in. After all, they have come for the various valuables that we are told the monks would have, taken into the tower. So surely that would mean people who had come for those values would follow them into the tower, It would have been so much more sensible to leave the valuables outside. It would give the raiders no reason to follow them. But to take the valuables into the towers, gold and silver artifacts, jewels, monetary donations from the faithful, the very things that the Vikings had come for, well, that would give the raiders a reason to force their way in, an incentive to devise a quick method of entry. I mean, I can't really, the abbot of the monastery, haranguing the Vikings. Listen to me now, you nasty evil Norsemen, you. We're putting all the treasures and money and the gold and stuff you've come for into this tower thingy here, and we're going in there and we're going to pull up the ladder, so we are. And we're going to sit there until you lot go away. No, I'm sorry you had all the trouble of coming here for nothing, sailing hundreds and hundreds of miles, coming here, since everything that you lot came for, all those hundreds of miles, is now nice and safe with us up here in this tower thingy. That shook you out, didn't it? Aye, that it did. Well, no, goodbye to you, and may the road rise before you on your way out. No, hardly. All in all, it seems much more likely that the towers are actually little more than belfries. A possible refuge in an emergency, to be sure, but not their intended purpose, and definitely not a place to put anything worth taking, at least if you didn't want somebody who had come there for that stuff to simply follow you straight in to get it. Another interesting example of something that may not be quite as we thought is the fact that Vikings may have come to Ireland well before the raiding started, come as traders. Something that those who wrote the Annals of Ulster, for example, probably wouldn't have bothered mentioning. After all, traders from elsewhere wouldn't have been uncommon. There'd be traders coming from Francia, from Britain. The fact that people were coming from the Scandinavian countries would probably have elicited no great interest. They weren't, after all, raiding at that stage, so the Irish would have had no reason to take any special notice of them coming here. Not so long ago, 4 Viking graves were discovered in Dublin's South Great George's Street. Nothing very odd about that. I mean, many graves have been found across the city. But when the archaeologist in charge had the remains dated, she was astonished to discover that these men had been buried long before Dublin was founded, well before the first recorded Viking raids. And this does suggest that trading vessels had preceded the dragon ships. Perhaps even early raiders had obtained useful information from these traders as to the location of wealthy monasteries, where were the best places to go. That's entirely possible. I mean, if I were a raider of the time and I knew nothing about Ireland, and I knew that Olafur had been there a few times trading, well, I'd go to him and I'd say, listen, where's the best place to go over there for the really good stuff, That would certainly seem to make sense to me. Intermarriage and cultural exchange between the Irish and the Norse became more frequent as time went on, many Norse converting to Christianity, usually without there being any actual compulsion on them to do so. And after a time it became hard to tell a Norseman or woman from their Irish counterparts. Sigurd Olafsson, Sigurd as he was known, a late 10th and early 11th century king of Dublin, is a good example of the joining of Gael and Norse, his father being a Norse nobleman and his mother an Irish princess. And that was a very common state of affairs at that time. And as a Christian himself, he founded Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral circa 1028 AD, the oldest surviving building in the city as it happens, though Sigurd's original building was made of wood. Even as early as 1014 AD, Irish and Norse had become so intertwined in marriage, in commerce and religion, many former pagans by that time being Christians, the majority of them in fact, that the Norse and the Dublin Irish fought together against King Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf. Now King Brian was not, as Irish school children were taught for decades, simply trying to drive the savage, ungodly, disgraceful pagans from Ireland, to save the holy Isle of Erin from the demonic evils of paganism. No, it was indicated that this was his sole reason for attacking Dublin. He simply wanted pagans out, Irish in. No, that's not the case at all. His interest was taking the kingdom of Dublin for himself, pure and simple, regardless of who actually controlled it, Gael or Norse. He had no interest in that. He simply wanted it. I'm sorry, school children of Ireland, Brian Boru was no great national hero, and he would actually have had a bit of a job to find many pagans in Dublin to drive out by that time, most of the Norse having converted to his own religion by that stage. The Norse influence on Ireland was immense, bringing new ideas and things like a proper monetary system. The already mentioned King Sigurd Olafsson founded the first Irish mint around 997 AD, minting proper Irish coins for the first time, rather than using Anglo-Saxon or even Arab ones, as had been done previously. Admittedly, they were copies of the English coins, but they were actually produced here in Ireland, each one made of silver and worth 1 penny, being a pennyweight, as they were called, which was a 240th part of a pound. The Norse founded towns. They brought advanced military technology and weapons and exposed Ireland to international trade on a scale that was impossible previously. Norse influence, after all, extended across half the known world, stretching from Greenland and North America to Baghdad, the countries that lay around the Mediterranean Sea, to Russia, a land that actually took its name from them, the local people calling them the Rus. And they had frequent access to the greatest centre of trade in the world, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The extent of their trading, it's well illustrated by the fact that large numbers of Islamic coins are found in Scandinavia. Over 200,000 Arab silver coins alone have been discovered in Norse burial sites, and even a ring with the name of Allah inscribed on it. Now, slaves. Slaves were a very important part of Viking raids in the early days, and continued to be even after they had established themselves, with Ireland one of the last countries in Europe, in fact, to abolish the practice of slave trading, despite the later efforts of the church to stop it. There had been slaves in Ireland, of course, long before the Vikings came. Oh yes, I hope it's not a shock, but even in the land of saints and scholars, in Holy Ireland, there were slaves. Oh yes. But they were largely prisoners of war or those enslaved for committing various crimes, rather than slaves as such. And slavery itself, of course, was common in the rest of Europe. One has to say, of course, it was pretty much common all around the world. There was no country on earth that did not have slaves at one time or another, and that is something that really does have to be remembered. And the Vikings, of course, made it a lucrative business venture in Ireland rather than a form of punishment, something it hadn't been previously in Ireland, and the country became a centre of the trade, eventually emerging as the largest slave market in Western Europe, centred on Dublin and obtaining the goods, I suppose, for want of a better word, both from the Irish hinterland and from raids on nearby Britain and Scotland. excavations in Dublin have turned up long slave chains designed to fasten groups of people together, which is basically collars joined together with chains, and you could fasten a whole row of people together, as well as individual collars that could be locked around someone's neck, just to make sure that your slaves weren't making a quick exit out the door while your back was turned. Not really the sort of fashion accessory I suppose one would really want. Anyway, but the slave trade should not be seen as any particular reflection on the Norse, since everyone else was doing it too. Every country in the world, as I said, had slaves at one time or another, which is something that is often overlooked. And they were simply supplying a demand, as good businessmen do, and they were very good businessmen. It was a simple matter of supply and demand. That's really what it came down to. It was not so much a moral consideration as simply a business one. And if they hadn't done it, well, someone else would. Well, of course, yeah, someone else was, but the Norse just did it better. They did it with more style, like their raiding. I mean, who else had these lovely ships with dragon heads on them? The Norse were much more booyah. A great deal of interesting information about the Norse in Ireland was discovered during archaeological excavations in Cork City during 2003 to 2005, which showed that they were exporting animal hides to Europe and they were importing wine from Francia. They reclaimed land from the River Lee, stabilising the swamp land by driving large split oak beams into the ground that would make it suitable for housing. And they even recycled wooden planks from old unserviceable longships to build jetties in the harbour. And the foundations of 19 wooden houses were discovered, dated to around 1070 AD. The Norse were highly accomplished metalworkers, merchants, tradesmen and tradeswomen. Many Norse women have been found buried with scales and weights and other things indicating their profession as merchants, as well as skilled farmers and builders. Some parts of their wooden buildings, such as those found at York or Jorvik, as the Vikings called it, were held together without even nails, relying on the pressure of one plank against another to hold them together, which was quite an advanced bit of technology. And they brought many of these skills to Ireland, of course, which would influence the native craftsmen and artisans. Perhaps their greatest achievement, though, was as shipbuilders. The, actually incorrectly named Viking Longship, being a masterpiece of construction, the most advanced warship of its day, indeed one of the finest ship designs in history, perhaps actually the finest ship design in history for the purpose for which the ship was built. And that gave them the ability to not only cross oceans, but to sail up rivers deep inland, using the rivers of Europe to travel from, say, the Baltic down to the Black Sea and Constantinople. And, of course, as we saw in part one, the ability to raid right into the Irish countryside with ease. No town that lay on a river with a depth of 3 feet or more was safe from the longships, no matter how far inland they might be. And since the keel of a longship was the same shape at both ends, should it come under, say, arrow attack from the riverbank or chain pulled across the river, well, the rowers could simply stand up, turn around and face the opposite way, and the ship could reverse direction almost instantly. Aspects of Norse shipbuilding methods and designs, like everything else, of course, also found their way into Irish ships, particularly a type known as a yawl, which was an ancient type of small craft which you can still find today around Achill Island off the coast of County Mayo. Originally, yawls were pointed at both ends, exactly like a Viking longboat, and built in the northern European clinker style, and they're regarded as having been inspired by the Norse ships, making them a living link today with the Vikings in Ireland. Now, it should be remembered, however, that the legendary longship, such as these over here, were only one type of Norse ship, a custom-designed warship. They're often seen as being, but that's the ship that the Vikings used, but there were actually other types of ships in use at that time, specialist cargo vessels, for example, Knorrs, just using a sail, only having a couple of oars for manoeuvring in harbour, useless for raiding purposes. They would have been far too small. There were quite small trading boats, that could be easily ported from one river to another. Since trying to drag a massive longship overland would have been awkward to say the least. Only the longships would have been fitted with the dragon or sea serpent heads on the prows, or the shields hung along the side, and they would actually have been removed. The dragon heads would have been taken off when approaching friendly harbours, so as not to frighten the landvættir, the spirits that protected the land. In Iceland, it was actually illegal to approach a friendly harbour with the dragon heads still fitted. So when you see in like the TV show Vikings, and there are all these ships lined up in Kattegat harbour, and they all have the dragon heads on them, that is completely incorrect. The heads would have been removed while the ship was in harbour, and would only have been put on when it put to sea. And also, of course, the merchant ships did not have those heads. The dragon heads and the shields and that were the prerogative of the warships. And if a longship was used for trading, which some would have been, someone who wished to trade and didn't happen to have a canoe, or some ship of that type would have used the longship, the dragon heads would not have been fitted. Your chances of getting a good deal in some friendly harbour would not have been improved if you came in with the dragon head on your ship, indicating that perhaps if you didn't get a good price for your goods, everybody was going to die. That would certainly have an effect on their willingness to negotiate with you. It should also be noted that there was actually no such thing as a Viking ship. No, it isn't strictly correct to call them Viking ships. The longships were simply ships in which a group of men, and sometimes women, were traveling. They were going somewhere, going Viking. The ship itself, well, it was just a ship in which Vikings were traveling, which there is certainly a difference there, which is usually not mentioned. Nor, as I said in part one, of course, did the Vikings ever call themselves Vikings, since they weren't. They were just going Viking. They were not being Viking. It was something one did, an occupation, not a term of nationality. As, of course, for most of their time in Ireland, they were not actually Vikings. No, they were settlers, townspeople, residents of the towns they founded, since leaping off ships with an axe in their hand wasn't required to live in Dublin or any of their other towns to plant crops or have families or anything like that. You didn't need to, use a ship to do that, and unless they were using a ship, they weren't Vikings. As I've said, Norse influence on Ireland was considerable. There are traces of that everywhere today in this country, especially with regards to names. Many Irish surnames being either of Norse origin or representing Irish descriptive names for them. Now, the Norse themselves, of course, had no hereditary surnames until late in the 18th century. In the Viking days, a surname was simply your father's name with son or daughter added on, which is known as patronymics. For example, the famous Viking Eric the Red had 2 children, a son named Leif and a daughter Freydis, their surnames being Eriksson and Eriksdottir, respectively. A naming system that is still used, of course, in Iceland and the Faroe Islands. And I think it's quite nice, actually. Irish names with Norse connections include MacBurney, son of Bjorn, MacManus, son of Magnus, MacAuliffe, son of Olaf, Reynolds, which comes from Ragnar. Then we find descriptive names such as Doyle, coming from the Irish dove, dark, and Gal, foreigner, meaning the son of the dark foreigner, or in other words, the son of a Dane, Dovgal as they were called. Norwegians being referred to as the Fingal, the fair foreigners. Any name ending in son is probably of Norse origin, as are quite a long list of other Irish names. You have Magna, Halpin, Broderick, Coppinger, Grimes, Harold, Cotter, Trant, Crangle, Braniff, Hewson, Kendrick, Kent, Kirby, Broder, Gaynor, Boland, Crosby, Rourke, Handrick and Hendrick, Story, Tuke, Thunder, Harford, Grimes, Killen, and Dromgoole. Town names that end in ford indicate a Norse origin from the word fjord, meaning an inlet, Waterford, Carlingford, Strangford, Wexford, for example. And the County Dublin coastal town of Skerries takes its name from the Old Norse skir, meaning a rock in the sea, because there is a rocky outcrop into the sea right beside the town. So the Norse are still very much with us today in Ireland. Many things, commonly thought of as Irish, actually having their origins in Scandinavia. The same, of course, can be said over in Britain. A very interesting Norse legacy is the area of Dublin north of the River Liffey known as Town, where I lived myself at one time. And there was once a settlement there founded by Norse Gaels known as the Ostmen, or the men from the east, rather than the fully native Gaels known as the Vestmen, or the men from the west. The settlement, Ostmanatun, the homestead of the Eastmen, was a distinct district of Dublin for centuries, even after the city spread out across the river to the north. Its name gradually being corrupted to Town as it is today, where the Norse influence is still apparent just by looking at the street names. There you will find Ivar Street, as it's pronounced here, Harold Road, Ostman Place, Olaf Road, Sigurd Road, Thor Place, Viking Road, Viking Place, Town Road, and Citric Road. Sadly, however, much of the Norse heritage in Dublin has been lost. Heritage that was there, and not just names, but actual buildings from that era, thanks to an astonishing lack of interest by those who should have preserved it, namely the Dublin City Corporation. The area of Dublin known as Wood Quay, which lies on the south bank of the River Liffey, close beside Christ Church Cathedral, was chosen by the Dublin Corporation in the early 1970s as the site for their new civic offices. Well, no problem with that, of course, but when they began to clear it to commence the construction, an amazing spectacle was unearthed. They had discovered Difflin. It was a fantastic archaeological treasure, a complete section of a Viking town, or, well, a Norse town, we should actually correctly call it. The virtually intact foundations of dozens of houses, storage buildings, yards, streets and pathways paved with wooden planks laid side by side. The quayside that would have lain on the bank of the river 1,000 years before, and buildings that probably housed the goods brought in by the ships that would have been tied up there. Nothing quite like it, so extensive and beautifully preserved, had ever been found previously in Ireland, and seldom anywhere else either. There's nothing even in Scandinavia that equaled it. And it astonished and horrified everyone when the city fathers decided to proceed with the civic office project. Though they agreed, they agreed to wait for the site to be examined. How very nice of them. Yes, you can go along there, you can examine it, see what you can find, then we're going to bulldoze it. Thank you, Dublin City Corporation. Archaeological excavations were carried out by the National Museum of Ireland from 1974 to 1981, but then they were halted for construction to begin. Now, public anger was extensive, especially after the High Court declared the entire site to be a national monument and thus protected from development. If something is a national monument, you can't so much as drive a nail into it. But the developers, they took advantage of a loophole in the law to get around the court order. Oh, those legal loopholes. And they went ahead with their construction plans. Thousands of people protested in the streets. Save Wood Quay! Became a rallying cry across the city. I remember it well. Never before had there been public protests on such a large scale, with many prominent figures, politicians and celebrities joining in, but to no avail. Though thousands of artifacts were removed and taken to the museum, which was, of course, very good, the wonderful buildings, they weren't even moved a bit at a time to another site, something which was entirely possible. Number them, move them, reconstruct them. No, it was done in Egypt, for example, with much larger structures, stone structures, massive statues of pharaohs, for example, entire temples being moved a stone at a time. But no, they were destroyed, and Viking Dublin banished beneath the new civic offices. Destroyed, not by war or time, but by those whose duty it had been to preserve it, the city fathers. Now, times have changed, of course. Something on that scale wouldn't happen these days. I mean, the Dublin City Council, as it's named now, I mean, they are obviously very keen on preserving anything historic. But that, of course, is of little benefit to a wonderful national treasure now lost forever. It was a dreadful archaeological crime, the destruction of a significant part of Dublin's history that had been so beautifully preserved for over 1,000 years. Should you ever visit Dublin, don't miss a permanent exhibition called Dublinia. It's housed in a building attached to Christ Church Cathedral, and it gives a fascinating account of Viking and medieval Dublin through artifacts, beautiful models of the city at various periods, reconstructed houses and shops, entire reconstructed streets, as well as hands-on items such as helmets and weapons, and guides dressed in period costume. You can even play a Norse chess game with one of them. It does seem very sad to me, however, that one can see a small reconstruction of Norse Dublin under a glass case, only a couple of 100 yards from where one could have seen the actual town itself, the real thing, not just a little model. The civic offices are hardly a substitute, nicknamed by Dubliners the bunkers, which, given their resemblance to the huge flak towers in Berlin and other German cities during World War II, seems rather appropriate. Put a few anti-aircraft guns on top of them and, well, they'd have blended right in. As I said at the start, without the Viking raids and their later settlements, medieval Ireland would have been a very different place, as would the Ireland that came to be later on, their influence on the country and its subsequent history being enormous. They influenced every aspect of Irish life in some way or another, cultural and political, economically and militarily. They brought new ideas and ways of doing things, and the Ireland of today owes them a great deal for what the country has become. A genetic study in January of 2018 discovered a considerable DNA trace left by the Norse, which has led to the suggestion that, well, they left an even greater impact on Ireland than was previously thought. And without them, the course of Irish history would have been different. Maybe better or maybe worse. We have no way of knowing, or indeed the extent of it, but it certainly would have been different. Celtic and Norman Saxon influences alone driving the country without the Norse contribution. Indeed, it's fair to say that Norse influence on Ireland was greater than it was in any of the other lands where they settled, with the exception of Normandy, and to a lesser extent the regions of present-day Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine that were settled by the Norse from Sweden known as the Rus. Though Slavic influence was far more extensive in that region than Irish influence, if you like, had been in Ireland. And the Slavs really didn't adopt anything very much from the Swedish Norse, who became its rulers, and they very, very quickly became just as Slavic as the people they were ruling. So their influence on that region was not as great as the Norse influence in Ireland. The Iceland, I suppose one has to say, doesn't count. Though obviously Norse in so many ways, since there was no established culture there prior to the arrival of the Norse settlers, as there was in Ireland, and it was they who were solely responsible for Iceland's culture, something that is, of course, very evident even today. The Icelandic language being extremely close to Old Norse, with many of the words are exactly the same, and others are similar enough that Eric the Red would still understand reasonably well what the Icelanders were saying, if you could bring him down to our own time in a time machine. Well, that concludes this look at the Vikings, or rather the Norse, as we should really say. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, I shall say farewell, goodbye, until then.